and welcome to my podcast, A Penny for Your Thoughts with me, Steve Penny. Over the coming weeks, I'm going to be talking to some great people. I hope you enjoy listening in. Thank you. I'm here today with Steven Moe, who I've actually visited and been a guest on his podcast a couple of times now. Steven, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself, saying who you are and what you do, and then we'll get into the questions and see where we go.
Yeah, well, kia ora. Thanks so much for the opportunity to be here. And I always love talking with people who've been on my podcast and then seeing what happens next. In your situation, you know, you're now doing this. It's really cool to see that connection point. So for me, I describe myself as a catalyst for impact. My role, or the goal that I want to have in my life, is to be a catalyst for impact, helping others to achieve things. Now, the specific way that I do that is a more traditional label, which is being a lawyer. It's kind of a different way to describe myself, but I view my job as a lawyer is to come alongside people to help them, support them with setting something up that's new, that wants to have a positive impact in society. So I work with many, many purpose-driven or impact-driven entrepreneurs or charities or a variety in the middle. Yeah, so that's kind of what I do.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Stephen. That's obviously how we met, because when I set this business up, I came in to see you just to know what to do to set a business up, having not done it before. So it's been great working with you and the Parry Field team, actually, over the last 5 years.
Yeah, I remember that, actually, when you came in and told me all about what you were planning. And that's kind of the fun part of my job, is I get to journey with people right from the beginning, right through, and then, you know, we're meeting now in this beautiful office here, and a couple of years have gone by.
It's nice to have your name over the door. You know, it kind of feels like you've made an impact if you do that. And so it's good. It's been 5 years now we've been going, so it seems like it's flying by at the moment, unfortunately. I know a little bit about your work life. What about personally? You married, children, and those kind of things?
Yeah, so I'm married. I've been married since 2005 to Ellie. She's actually from England. We met in Wellington, and I am really fortunate that we've been able to journey around the world together with my career. So had 3 years in Wellington, had 3 years in London, 3 years in Tokyo, and 4 years in Sydney.
Wow.
And Ellie and I basically have had children along the way. Right. So one child was born in London, one in Tokyo, 2 in Sydney, and then we came back 7 years ago to be more part of this ecosystem and what's going on here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I should say as well, when people heard me beginning to talk, they heard my accent.
Yes.
And they thought, oh, where is he from? So I actually moved to New Zealand in 1983. So
wow. Okay.
I grew up here.
Yeah.
This has been home ever since I remember. It's not that I'm 90 years old now. It's just that I was 7 years old when we moved here.
Yeah.
So that's been a bit of my journey. Is we moved down. My father was a marine biologist, so that's what brought us to New Zealand. But I studied it in Christchurch in high school. I went to Canterbury University.
Right.
I became a lawyer, worked in Wellington.
But you've managed to cling onto your accent. Yeah,
it's an interesting thing, isn't it? I always say to people, though, if you went overseas, would you lose your accent?
Well, yeah. My kids are they're 20, 22 and 24 now. So when we came over here in 2010, they were still quite young. And I would say that the eldest is probably the one that's clung onto her accent most. Out of the three of them. The other two seem to have acclimatised more to the Kiwi accent. But they all still sound English compared to their school friends. So, I think it's something you pick up very early, obviously.
Yeah. Well, like I say, I was 7 when we first moved here, 7 turning 8. But also remember that era, like 1983, 1984. I came into a country town, a place called Papakayo, just near Amaru, and imagine I'm walking in with my Atari video game. You know, the movies are all from the States, so I can imagine it was a novelty to have this American child in this New Zealand system. So maybe I liked it. I don't know.
Like to stand
Otherwise,
out.
It's strength of character.
Yes,
You know?
absolutely, yes. So you've been a lawyer all of your career, all of your working career.
Yep.
What made you choose that path?
Well, I've always loved reading and writing. It sounds kind of basic, but, history, I did another degree in history and political science. And to be a good lawyer, you have to be able to read and express yourself and write. So those were two things I've always been good at. And so when I got to university, I actually studied biology, sociology, history, English, and law. And basically, it's kind of a competitive system in the New Zealand system. So you get into second year and well, I got into second year. Well, maybe I should do it.
Yeah.
And so it, in some ways, stumbled into it in the sense of I didn't have a parent who was a lawyer. I didn't have an example in my immediate family. But I also had people I knew who were lawyers, and they seemed to enjoy what they did. And, my honors paper was in human rights.
Okay.
And so I always saw the law as being a key to open doors that would otherwise be closed. At the beginning, I joined one of the biggest firms in New Zealand called Russell McVeigh. So I was getting into the corporate side of law. But 7 years ago, when I came back from an international career, working with 4,000 lawyers in one law firm, 55 offices, it was an English law firm. I really reinvented my career at that point and said, I want to work with people who are focused on impact and purpose.
Right. Okay. And what was it you think that drew you to that idea of having, a close association with people that want to make an impact? What about your upbringing or what you've learned along the way has made you focus there?
Well, I think as you get older, you start reflecting on influences. So one of the key influences for me was my parents. Right. I think all of us, for better or worse, they're our first reference points.
Absolutely.
And I was very fortunate to be born into a family where they were very international. So my father had joined something called the Peace Corps in the 1960s, which was set up by John F. Kennedy. He was one of the first volunteers to go as an alternative to going to Vietnam.
Wow.
He went to Chile and was working in setting up cooperatives for poor fishermen. And he met my mother, who was also in the Peace Corps. She's from Panama originally. So they fell in love in Chile. They both speak Spanish. So I grew up with, a family culture of people who were traveling around the world. They moved to Rome after that. They worked for the United Nations. Then they worked for an Indian tribe in Washington State. Then they moved to Florida, where I was born. Then they moved to Oregon. So it was a family of itinerant, nomads moving around the world. Yeah. But I learned a lot from them. And one of the things they taught me was that experience trumps money. So it's more important to build experiences into your life than it is to build up your bank balance. Yeah. So I think from them, the fact that they had the courage to move to New Zealand in 1983, to leave behind all that they had in the States and move here, that was kind of a mentality of pushing and going to new places. Yeah. So when I was 21, I moved to Japan. I didn't speak the language at that time, but I moved because it was an adventure. I've always lived my life from that point on, actually, because a lot of people advise me, stay in university, finish your law degree, then you can have an adventure. And one of my friends took me aside with my father and said, actually, when you're 90, will you regret not going to Japan? Yeah. And so that's been a barometer for decision making, which is, will I regret this if I don't make the choice today when I'm 90 and I'm looking back on my life? Yep. Am I going to wish that I'd done that thing?
Yeah. That's certainly the way I think I've lived my life as well. I had an opportunity to work in the Middle East before we came to New Zealand. Mm-hmm. And it was that question that made me decide to go. If I don't go, I'll look back and say, why didn't I? Why didn't I try it, see what it was like? Because I think, there's... In your work life in particular, right, you can have experiences of any kind, and they're not either good or bad. They're really what you make of them. Mm. And if you close the door on an experience, you don't know what you're going to miss out on. You learn something everywhere you go.
Yeah. And the other thing is that nothing is ever wasted in life.
No.
So even if it doesn't work out the way you thought it would, it sets you up for something else that's coming.
Absolutely.
But the proviso to that is you have to have the eyes open to see those opportunities.
Yeah. For sure.
Not see them as failures or it didn't work and I lost. Like I lived in Japan at age 21. I was able to learn Japanese, teach English, and now I realize that when I'm interviewing people on the podcast, I have a clear way of speaking, which comes from teaching people to learn English, which now helps me with the podcasting. Yep. And also it opened up the opportunity because I learned Japanese. Later on, I moved back there because the law firm found out I spoke Japanese. So they were like, well, you should go help set up this office. Yep. So those opportunities would never have come if I hadn't
take that chance,
taken the risk to go somewhere. And so what? It's a year that I spent in Japan at age 21. I learned so much more in that year than I did at university, 5 years studying.
Well, there is no substitute for a life experience, I would say. When you come out of university with a degree, it's great. You've learned something that allows you to get the degree. If you have no life experience, then you're not really a contributing member of any workforce because you haven't got any experience to rest that on. And I've certainly find when I'm bringing people into the business, life experience is more important than having a degree, because that's what makes you who you are. Really, the degree is just it's a marker. It's something that shows you can meet a certain academic standard. But how you apply that knowledge is going to come from your life experience for sure. Yeah.
Which is why it's crazy that in high school and universities we don't have courses about interpersonal relationships and delegation and team working and
public
building,
speaking as well.
All of those things, those are the actual skills you need. The ability to memorize cases in my situation, like for criminal law, anyone listening who's a lawyer will remember you have to literally memorize 300 cases and what they mean. Do I remember any of those cases? No. Of course, I've learned a lot through having to memorize the logic, but it's actually the interpersonal skills that's far more important to me.
Yeah, that's very true. My qualifications are much more more physics based, so lots of mathematics, most of which I don't use anymore. But I think the thing that I recognised as I got older is actually knowing that sort of base information allows me to interrogate something that somebody else sends to me and know where it should be. And if the answers I'm getting don't look right, my experience tells me they don't look right. They're usually not right. Yeah. And it's that having that base knowledge, like you say, about remembering the sort of the logic of the legal cases and then being able to apply that to a case that's in front of you. Without that logic, you wouldn't necessarily be able to make the same decision. So I think that's it's a good grounding for sure. Yeah. Okay. What else what would you say at this point would be your proudest work achievement?
Well, work achievement. So I'm doing a lot in purpose-driven businesses and impact-driven businesses. So I think one of the key things was writing a book called Social Enterprise in New Zealand. So that came out in 2017. And that was really a statement about the future direction of business. And for me, that was planting a flag in the sand. And there's no one else has written a book about legal structures for social enterprises, which is code for purpose-driven businesses. So I think that has been a really important thing. And then also contributing to a paper that the Akina Foundation produced, looking at the future of business in New Zealand. That was in 2019. Some of those initiatives, because I meet people today and they're now referring to those reports or that book that it helped them. At the time, I didn't realize it, but actually it's had a bigger impact than I realized at the time. The side thing that I'm really enjoying is Seed's podcast. So like you, but I've done that a little bit longer than you. So I've now done, this week will be episode 355. Wow. So you can imagine the hours it takes to produce a podcast. That's going now 6 years I've done that.
I'm at episode 6 or 7, I think it is released this weekend. So I'm a long way to go.
I'm in the single digits. That's great.
Long way to go. Turning that around the other way, what would you say is the biggest challenge that you've faced?
I think for me, it was getting a clear sense of who I was. It sounds really strange to say that, but I think for lots of people listening as well, there's you, like we're saying, you train in something, you get your first job, but does it really have the essence of who you are? So the way this was explained to me, or that I've found helpful, is imagine a bell, and you've got the bell and you strike it, but it's sitting on the table. It doesn't make a sound. You have to lift the bell up and then strike it, and then it will make an echoing out that everybody can hear. And I think very often in our careers and our work, we get caught in situations where we think that that's the only thing that we can do because that's what we've done. And actually, sometimes you have to break free of that. And in my case, it was breaking free of what I called the golden handcuffs of a career in an international law firm. They pay you well. They also demand your soul.
Yes.
And therefore, how can I reinvent my career in a way that involves giving back in a generative, positive way to help other people on their journeys?
I think that's something that comes with age as well. Spending time learning who you are, learning what you like and what you don't like, how you can best use your skills. It doesn't happen when you leave school. You need a few years of trying different things out, and that's where taking those opportunities is important, thinking that maybe this isn't the career I want, but I'll probably learn something and hopefully that will lead to something else. And so I think it's good to make those decisions, I think, when you've got the opportunity to do so. Here's one that's sometimes a bit difficult to answer, but could you point to a time where you learnt something or read something that really changed your worldview?
Well, I heard something recently. It's in the process of changing me.
Right.
And it was basically, I've heard it a couple times from different people, so it's now reinforcing. It was, what is it that you're doing that might fail? Mm-hmm. And the point is, are you playing it too safe? Are you just settling? Are you simply doing the same thing over and over because you're worried? And the challenge from the person, I think it was through a Seth Godin podcast, and then somebody else was mentioning it, was if you're not at the point of something might not work out, then you're not pushing
hard enough.
You're not pushing yourself enough, because you've got to dream big. To dream big, to have ambition, means that something might not work out the way you want it. But if you don't have that vision or that desire to do something bigger, then you're just going to become trapped within the way you've always done things. So for me, I've got this conference coming up in October. It's called the Seeds Impact Conference. Mm-hmm. And I'm hoping to get 1,000 people to show up. And I don't know if it's going to work out, but I'm willing to risk it and to, quote marks, fail.
Yeah.
Because I know that I need to push myself to try something that I haven't done in exactly this way before. So having 27 different sessions over one day across 4 different Zoom rooms, that's pushing things.
Yep.
But I want to do that, and I want to potentially not have all the people show up that I think will. Mm-hmm. But, if I'm not willing to take the risk, then I'm just going to settle. And get stagnant. So that's the biggest mindset shift for me recently.
I think that's something that I would say is true of myself as well. Like, setting this business up was a big risk. But again, it was that if I don't do it now, because I was 50 at the time that I set the business up, if I don't do it now, I'm probably never going to. Being brave enough to back yourself to do something that's outside your comfort zone is certainly a good way of learning as well. You put yourself in a position where you've got to learn a lot of new skills. That's a good thing. It keeps your mind active, keeps your body active. Doesn't do your stress levels much good sometimes, it's fair to say. But it's certainly a good way to look. Who would you say was your biggest influences? I think you mentioned your parents were big influences.
Yeah, my parents were big influences. I'm really fortunate that my wife is a huge part of my life.
Yep.
And so she's there supporting me. This job that I have is quite demanding. People sometimes are surprised when I say that I can easily get 250 to 300 emails in one day.
Yeah.
So having the capacity to respond to them and to be available for meetings, and, it takes a lot of effort.
Yes.
So she's freed me up to be able to do that. And that's a choice we've been able to make in terms of how we divide responsibilities, essentially. But I learn a lot from her, and I really value the role that she plays and impacts me. And I think as well, the guests that I've had on the show means that I've got a real big network of people who I really admire. So I've learned a lot from each of them. Talking about doing things that might not work out, I'm just about to release a book called Seed Habits.
Right.
Which is things I've learned from all the guests, including you.
Really?
Yeah. So it's a list of 9 habits that I think if we all learned them, we would have better choices in the future. I've gone through all 355 interviews and then distilled out some core things that I think are going to be helpful for people.
Excellent.
So I'd say that those guests have been influences on me, and I just love meeting people who are challenging and pushing things and trying something new. You do your best.
You do your best, absolutely, yeah. I mean, if you were looking back at your early career, would you say, is there anybody in that early career that you would say was an influence as well?
In the early career, let's see. I mean, there were people along the way who gave me opportunities.
Yeah.
And I had to grasp them.
Yeah.
And, when I first moved to London, I was doing temping work, going from law firm to law firm. And there was a guy who basically saw me working in his team and said, you should work for our law firm. So if he hadn't given me that opportunity, I wouldn't have been able to continue on in that career at that point. Yeah, I think there's been lots of influences, though. I do read quite a lot, so I feel like even though they're long gone, there's authors that I resonate with, like the Fyodor Dostoevsky, some of the novels that he wrote transcend time. And others, they're quite niche, but someone like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who died during World War II, killed for his beliefs, essentially, like, that's quite a strong example to me.
Yeah.
Tolkien and Lord of the Rings and I just love the characters of Aragorn, and they're
very well developed. They're very well developed characters in Lord of the Rings. That's a book that I go back to quite regularly. I first read it when I was probably about 11 or 12 years old, and I found at the time I was struggling a bit at school and a bit of bullying and stuff going on. And reading that book allowed me to escape from that for a little while. I think that's what I like about reading. Is if you've got a really good book, you become kind of separate from your day-to-day life, and you can really get deeply ingrained in what's going on in the story. And I think if it's a good author, then that's the best way to spend some time. You learn something. It's good to read the language, and it's also good to just let your mind wander and imagine being in that particular story.
I read it a similar age to you, and I remember just the nobility of some of those characters. Like Aragorn is the obvious one, is the unknown king.
Yes.
And you first meet him, and he's kind of this shifty character. You're not really sure who he is, but then he ends up being the most noble, and takes his rightful place. And I agree with you. Those sorts of books can inspire you. There's a local podcast called the 232 Podcast, which looks into books. So I'd recommend you have a listen to it.
I'll have a listen.
Sean and Carl are always talking about books that have influenced them right here in Christchurch. So.
No, definitely check that out. Another podcast I've been listening to, because talking to you on your podcast kind of opened my eyes to that sort of medium as a communication tool. And I've been listening to a podcast called The Infinite Monkey Cage. I don't know if you've heard of that.
No, I haven't heard that.
It's actually Professor Brian Cox and a comedian called Robin Ince. And they're basically talking about current science. It's been going since about 2007, 2008, I think. So there's thousands of episodes. But it's a 35-minute introduction to science on different topics every episode. And it's really eye-opening, some of the stuff they're talking about. And Robin Ince is there as a sort of, I guess, the common man compared to Brian Cox's huge intellect, and sort of balances the show out really well. And I think that sort of thing, trying to get people engaged in topics using lots of different mediums is a good way to go. And certainly podcasts are becoming the thing. There's so many people doing them now. So jumping on
I'd
the band.
encourage you to keep doing yours, because what will happen is at some point you'll realize that it's quite hard to continue.
Yes.
Like you get to 10 or 12 or 15, and then it's like, oh, I got to do another one now. But I've found that it really opens up the depth of conversations with people, even like what we're talking about. If we had a coffee, we probably wouldn't have gone to the depths of like my parents who influenced me and my career and all this. And I find that the medium of the voice is a very powerful way to capture the essence of a person.
Absolutely.
Because listening to the way I express myself, it's very different to you, but you can kind of get a sense of who I am. And I realized the power when I interviewed my grandmother, who was 90, and asked her about her life. This is before she died in about 2009. And that was when I realized that I now have a record of my grandmother talking that I can share with my children, and they can hear her southern accent, and just the way she talked. And it's just very, very, the essence of
You can almost get an image of somebody by the sound of their voice, actually, can't you? Sometimes it's completely wrong.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting, because sometimes you listen to people on a phone and you're like, oh, you must be 20, but actually they're 60. Or you must be 60, but actually they're 20. And I think that's really interesting, to think about how does our voice convey who we are.
Who we are, And you can also get a completely wrong image in terms of the type of person they are from their voice only as well. That's why I think humans need to see every part of, need to see the body language, need to see the facial expressions and everything else as well as the voice to fully understand who somebody is.
I'm really grateful that we're doing this in person. Like we're literally across the table from each other, because I love to look someone in the eye and ask them a question. And I've done a lot by Zoom. During COVID, I had to do it by Zoom because there was no other way. But I found that it's much richer if you're in the same room because of the body language.
It's easier to engage with somebody when you're in the room with them. I think Zoom's got its place, but face-to-face is by far and away the best way to talk to anybody, I think, for sure.
That's right.
Okay, so if outside of work, what do you do to recharge your batteries and relax?
Well, for me, I feel, and this, I think later on you're going to ask about an unpopular opinion, but I feel like the work that I do is actually recharging. And that sounds really strange, but I don't mind on the weekend. Sometimes I will just sit there and I'll write an article on governance for the Institute of Directors. And that is a recharge. Right now, they've just accepted one for publication, which is looking at in meetings, why do we have motions? Like I move it. Who wants to second that?
Yeah.
I second it.
Yeah.
So in this article, my amazing co-authors and I, Karen Rangi and Mere Wendt, we're questioning that this is a Western conception, decision-making, individualizing who put it forward and who seconded it. Whereas actually from a Te Ao Māori perspective, indigenous perspective, why do we do that? It should be a consensus decision rather than this person gets the credit for moving it. So anyway, I wrote that on a weekend, and I now, it's going to get published. So I get incredible joy from unlocking ideas that nobody else has written about. So that's one. I can't find anyone in the world who's written about that topic. So it's really exciting. It's fun. And then also I do a lot of editing of my podcast because it does take time and effort,
it does,
as you know, to edit it up and do the little intros and the outros and the social medias.
I didn't even know what an outro was before I started doing the podcast.
Right.
Like, what's an outro? And then I realised it's logical really when you think about it.
Yeah. But people don't realise the time and effort it takes. And then right now I'm just finishing picture book, which is called The Apple Tree. That's going to print with Caxton Press in the next week.
Cool.
And I'm printing 4,000 copies, so there's a leap of faith. But it's all about our lives and what matters and why do we do what we do. So I wrote a short story. I then found an illustrator, and we've collaborated to do this.
Oh, nice.
Cricket McCormick is her name. That's going to be available, and it will be a different outlet. So I guess you can't put me in a box as, oh, Steven, he's a lawyer.
Yeah.
Because I do a podcast, I write a picture book, I'm doing governance related things with IOD, I don't like the idea that, oh, he's a lawyer and therefore these assumptions hold true. Yeah. I want to question those assumptions, and I want to be an example for the next generation of lawyers that actually you can do a lot more
than just be a lawyer.
Simply moving paper from here to there.
Yeah, I think that's something that is coming through in the current generation, is that they don't want to be, don't want to have one career. They want to have whatever they want to do whenever they want to do it, and be a lot more flexible about the way they approach their lives, which I think is something that probably wasn't available when we were younger as an option to do.
Yeah.
But the way that work is now, there's a lot more opportunities to try different things, and I think this makes you a more rounded person. The more things you try, the more experiences you have. Yeah, definitely a good way to go.
Well, the unpopular opinion of this is I don't believe in work-life balance.
Right.
Because people throw that out all the time, like, oh, is your work-life balance right? But if you think about it, it doesn't make logical sense to me. Because you're saying work is here and life is there, and they need to balance. Because I don't like my work, and it is only there to sustain me to do my life, which is outside of work. What an unintegrated view of what your life could be. Because if you actually could love what you do in your work, and that was part of your life, then you're not splitting it into dual personalities, like, at 5 p.m., I'm finishing my work so I can live life. What a limited way of thinking about it. So I prefer the term work-life integration, which then says, well, actually, if you can find a career that you love and you're helping people and you're able to do something which is called ikigai, which is a Japanese term for what will people pay you for, what do you love, and what contributes to the world. The sweet spot in the middle is something that is not just work. It's actually
the whole thing,
part of you, a holistic view of a human.
I think I've a couple of conversations I've had on this podcast that has been around it not being a balance, more of a blend, and I think that integration and blend, the same principle, that if you do love what you do as a career, then you can't really easily separate it from your personal life anyway. And I think it's unreasonable to say to anybody, when you go to work, all your personal stuff stays outside the door, and when you leave work, all your work stuff stays behind the door. It doesn't work like that. Humans are complete entities, and everything they do is part of them. So I think that's that balanced, or the balanced, is an old-fashioned view, and it's very much a case of people who do a 9-to-5 job and are only doing it because it's a job and not a career. And I think we need to find a way of making jobs into careers so that you enjoy what you do and feel like you're contributing in some way. That's an interesting viewpoint, I think. So if we could do a little bit of time travel, send you back to your 20-year-old self, what do you think would be the key piece of advice you'd give?
Yeah, this is a great question, and I ask it of my guests sometimes as well.
Yeah.
I actually don't regret anything in my life. So I think that's the first thing, is that I have learned from every mistake. I have learned from all the things that didn't work out.
Yeah.
So I don't think I would go back and, well, maybe I would tell myself to buy some Bitcoin in 2011. But, it's like actually going through that hard time when I was 21, in Japan, not speaking the language. I learned so much from that.
Yeah.
So if I were to take that experience away, I wouldn't have become the person I am today. The thing that I'm learning, though, is that we're too limited in our conception, and we view ourselves by our lifetime.
Yeah.
And what we need to do is realize that we are merely baton holders for the next generation.
Yeah.
So I hope that some projects that I'm working on around the future of business and how we define the role of business, reimagining business, that will be something that I won't solve in my lifetime, but I will pass it on to the next generation, who hopefully will continue running. And in a Western conception, we only think very limited way. Think about quarterly profit reports, or a yearly report. How often do we think about a 150-year plan for change? And if we had that conception, we would live in a completely different world, because we'd be thinking about our great-great-grandchildren when we're making decisions today. I think that for me, that's a different way of thinking about things. And the story I would give on that one is, I was recently in Barcelona. So as you probably know, the most famous architect designer from Barcelona was Gaudi. And what did he design? Well, many things, but one of the most famous things he designed is called the Sagrada Familia, which is an amazing church. He designed it, I think it was 1885, okay? He died in 1925. He did not see it finished. But he started the foundation, started the building, was able to have the vision that is now, it will be completed, I think, in this decade. So 130 something years later from when it began, it will finally be done. So I love that story, that it's about an intergenerational perspective rather than a limited
We're too
conception of time.
We're very much a short-term society in the West, I think.
We are, and I think it comes back to a word which we sometimes use, which is spirituality as well. We have a very limited understanding, and in the West, a very dumbed-down understanding of spirituality and a dimension of people that actually maybe there's more to life than living and dying. There's more to life than money and houses and satisfaction in the moment. If we have a true conception of long-term thinking, then it changes your perspective massively. It does. The other thing about Gaudi is when he built that church, it would have been easier for him to design a normal church. But guess what? Today, in 2023, 5 million people visit that church. So he had a vision of what it could be, which is completely different to what a normal building is. And you know more about this than me from an architectural, building perspective. No one would go visit it. Like there's probably hundreds of churches in Barcelona. Do they get 5 million visitors a year? No. But it's because he had the vision to do something that was different and conceive the world in a new way. So for each of us in our lives, how are we conceiving the world in a way that will leave a lasting difference rather than just building another box shape that looks the same as the others?
I mean, that's part of the sort of thinking for me behind the other podcast that I want to start, is to try and educate people in some ways about how we can design things better and stop looking at what's the cheapest cost and how can we get this done the quickest, and start thinking about what can we do that's going to allow this building to perform really well for a long time, so we're not wasting time, money, energy, and having a negative impact on the planet around us. And I think the Maori culture in particular, is very much focused on being part of the environment rather than separate to the environment. And I think we need to learn a lot in the West about how we blend with the environment around us rather than how we fight against the environment around us. There's a lot of the design work that I do is trying to exclude the external environment because it's not what we want. But if you design the building better, the external environment can be a benefit to the building. And then you reduce your energy footprint, you reduce the amount of carbon you're producing, you reduce a lot of negative impacts on the environment around you. And that having that understanding is a little bit different because it doesn't really usually end up with a building that's the cheapest option out there on first cost. But we're slowly changing, I think, to realise that first cost is only a small part of what you pay for a building. And like you're saying with Gaudi and his approach, he's looking at something that's going to be there for a long time. It means that it's built once and it lasts for hundreds of years. No building nowadays will last more than about 20 years, maybe 30 years. And then it'll be demolished and you put another one in its place that's a slightly different function. Why don't we design the building so they can have multiple functions in them over their life? Because it's more expensive today.
And that's that limited view, which
Absolutely.
is only looking at the numbers on the page rather than the bigger conception.
Exactly.
I'd be interested in your thoughts on this as well, just picking up on what you're saying, from a Te Ao Maori perspective or a Pacifica perspective, because I've looked at this as well. I'm on a trust which is looking at papakainga housing, which is basically community living in a Maori setting. And one of the things that I've realized in looking at that is that in a Western conception, think about the houses that we built. Like think about England. You can still visit stone houses, that were carved into the surface. You dig out the earth and then you put in the foundations and it sits there. It's there for a long time. Whereas in a indigenous perspective or Maori perspective, it was much more moving with the seasons. And you didn't go in, and from that conception, Papa Tuanuku, Mother Earth, isn't something that you would just carve up and build for forever. So anyway, it's going against what we're saying here, which is a long-term perspective. But the idea that
lowering the impact. That's it.
Yeah.
Using the local materials, because one of the things that we're great at in the West is importing materials from all over the world to build something here, rather than using what we've already got in the country, because we want something that's over there that might be a little bit cheaper to buy. That sort of focus on cost and focus on temporary, short-term outcomes is why we've had such a negative impact on the environment globally. We're in a climate crisis because we've got a short-term view, and we need to change that view. Otherwise, our next generation is going to be struggling with all of the stuff that we've left behind. And I think that's the other part that I like about the Maori culture, is where they, their view is that we are holding onto the land to pass on to the next generation. It's not ours. We're just looking after it for the next generation. And we've got to treat it like that, because if we don't, there won't be a next generation. And that is becoming quite a scary reality when you look at the way things are going at the moment in the world and look at the weather events we're getting. We are really pushing this planet to the limit. People keep saying that we're going to kill the planet, which is a complete misnomer. We're not. What we're going to do is kill ourselves, and then the planet will be back to normal and it will settle and it will be much better without us. We could actually learn to work with it, then we could enjoy this planet for a lot longer. The sun's got 5 billion years to go. There's no reason why we shouldn't be there in 5 billion years' time.
And then the thing is taking this mindset of the longer term perspective and applying it to other parts of our life. For example, the next time your child is going to a birthday party, do you go to the warehouse and buy some bits of plastic, that will get looked at and then thrown away? Our conception about what we're getting people is, again, it's sort of limited in time.
It's consumerism. We've grown up in a society where the TV's selling you stuff all the time. It's on. We think that if we haven't got what's on the TV, then we're missing out in some way. And, we're all ingrained in that process, unfortunately, and it's difficult to step outside it. And I've actually come to realise of late that I started my life working when I was 16, and I was a very sort of conservative voting person because that's my family and my upbringing. And as I've gotten older, I've got more and more socialist. And I've realised that really being a conservative and effectively being a capitalist is a very lonely road, and you're only interested in yourself when you do that. I've actually joined this group, Orange Sky. I don't know if you've heard of them. They actually provide mobile showers and washing facilities and clothes washing facilities for homeless people around Christchurch and Australia. So I'm volunteering with them once a fortnight, spending a couple of hours helping out with that. And I'm doing that because I think homelessness is something the West has got horribly wrong. there shouldn't be anybody living on the streets because we've got way too much available to us to allow anyone to have to live on the street. It's something for me that is really important that we do something about it. And this is a small thing, but part of the idea behind this is you give people some dignity. If you give them the facilities to clean their clothes and clean themselves, it gives them back a bit of dignity. And, that dignity is important, and it makes them feel that they're part of the community rather than separate from the community. And, that again is sort of leaning towards the Maori side of things, that the family isn't just who you're married to and who your kids are. It's everyone around you that's part of your group. And I think that whānau approach is something we could all learn from. And I'm keen to try and do as much as I can, coming fairly late to the party. But, I think as soon as you realise you can make an impact, you should. Whatever it may be, however small it may be, if you can help somebody, you're doing a good thing.
Yeah, that's it. Exactly. Well, in the show notes, you should put a link to Orange Sky.
I think I will do.
They meet down at Kairos?
They've got 4 or 5 sites. The one that I go to is out at Hornby.
Okay.
But there's 4 or 5 sites around Christchurch. They started over in Australia, a couple of young lads over in Australia.
Yeah, I know about them. Yeah. I was at Kairos recently down where the stadium's being built, just opposite. They've got a food rescue place for people to come and get food, and they had that there. So, it's a great charity, to be honest with you. And I've been talking to people and saying I wanted to do something to help the homeless, and I was actually just walking along up Madras Street, and there was a bus shelter with the Orange Sky sign on it, and I saw it and I thought, that's what I want to do. Wow, that's cool.
like yourself, I'd do this, and it's something I do because it fills my cup. It makes me feel like I'm doing something that's not for me, it's for somebody else.
Yeah. Well, there's a principle in life there, which is, think about if you have to lead a discussion or prepare a study, you get way more out of it than the people attending, right? Like if you have got to present on this thing for 25 minutes, so you go away and become an expert on it. Like you get so much more. So it's about, by giving back, you're actually receiving.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. You're an avid reader, you said.
I love books. I've got lots and lots of books. I actually have a little batch. My wife and I bought a batch out near White Cliffs.
Okay.
And we're doing it up now. It's really bad. It had no toilet. It had like a compostable toilet system. Yeah. But anyway, my plan is that there's going to be walls where books will be able to be put and read, and then I'm going to invite artists and poets and people to come and stay there, and then they can write and create more art. I've always loved books. I can't walk into a secondhand bookstore and not walk out with something. So I think my favorite book, it's hard to pick one, but there's a book by an author called Annie Dillard. Yep. And she won the Pulitzer Prize, and it's called The Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. Okay. It's a really odd title. It came out, I think, 1977, something like that. So it's been around a long time. It's quite famous in America, not famous here at all. But essentially, it's a diary of her living alone in nature for 1 year.
Oh, right.
So the chapters are kind of like springtime and autumn and winter, and she's describing what she's seeing and the animals and the butterflies and the streams, but it's done in an extremely poetic way. It kind of moves you at a soul level rather than a nonfiction book about this event. Yeah. So it's almost a spiritual book for me. I can read a couple lines from it and feel like a connection to nature. Yeah, so that would be a book that I would recommend.
Okay, and what are you reading at the moment?
I like to get, like you were saying before, just to get completely out of my normal day. Yep. So I have a few, I guess you'd call them fantasy books about alternative worlds. So there's a guy, Brandon Sanderson, who's written quite a few novels. And so he's got a series called The Way of Kings. Each one is like 1,000 words, and there's multiple editions. It's a series
good collection,
of 10 books that he's planning, and he's written 5 or 6 of them. So I'm just reading that one for fun. But I've always got multiple books being read at any one time.
Yeah. Well, I think it's good to have that sort of resource available to you. That we're losing contact. I mean, I don't know about you, but I like books that are made out of paper. Yeah. And I don't like reading on the iPad or on the computer. Yeah. I just like the sensation of actually holding a book and physically turning the pages. Because I think you get it. For me, that's part of the experience. If you don't have that, just sort of flicking across on the screen, it doesn't feel the same to me at all.
Yeah, well, I even go further in that I like to get first edition of books and get the ones that are signed by authors.
Yeah.
Because I feel like if I can get a book of poetry and the poet signed it, there's a special connection to that piece of paper. You know,
absolutely,
So I've got many first editions of authors, like Annie Dillard, the one I mentioned. I've got almost all of her books in first edition.
Oh, nice.
So it's probably about 20 books, and many of them signed. And then I collect Alan Curnow books. So he's a originally Canterbury poet. He died in 2001 when he was about to turn 90. So he wrote from 1933 to 2000. So 70 years of content. And I've got almost all of his books as well. So it's just, I like to collect those memory points. And
that's awesome.
Yeah. I have another unusual collection, which is old maps of New Zealand.
Yeah.
So I've got some that date back to the 1600s when, so this is obviously European visions. The Maori were here far, far before then, but these were the first paper maps showing New Zealand from a European, so Tasman, Abel Tasman's perspective. I've got some of the first maps that ever were produced.
It's interesting to see how, I mean, when you think about how those maps were produced, they were produced without the benefit of flight. So how sometimes they're remarkably accurate in the way that they're drawn. And you think the level of skill and vision you need to draw a map of a country without being able to go above the country and look down at it is quite remarkable, really. It's a hell of a skill.
The Cook map is pretty accurate. You know, that was in the late 1700s and 1780s. And
cartographers were used to be very skilled. Well, I think they probably are still very skilled people. But when you think about the context of doing that in the late 1600s, 1700s, the technology was a pen and a paper. And you know, it's quite an amazing feat to produce those maps of the whole world. To a large extent, mapped like that is amazing.
I've got some where if you put them all together, they form a globe, which is about 10 meters, so bigger than this office. And each bit is showing a part of the world. But this was in 1700s, you know, so they had a vision. So
you're not a flat earther then?
No.
Good to hear. So one of the other questions I like to ask, just to see where it goes, is if you could meet somebody, either dead or alive, that you've never met and spoken to, who would it be?
Well, I love family history. So for me, I think I'm going to go back to one of my great-great-grandparents. So this was a guy who lived in he was born in the 1840s, and he died in the 1890s. My great-grandfather was his son. So it's my great-great-grandfather. His name was William Conrad, and he grew up just before the Civil War in America. So this is like 1850s, 1860, you know, that era. And he suffered from some type of a medical condition. We're not sure exactly what, but his parents said, go to Europe. And so they were obviously wealthy enough to be able to send him. So my great-great-great-grandfather was an architect in Philadelphia. Anyway, he went to Europe and spent a whole summer, basically months, traveling around Europe, and he wrote a book about it. And so because I love family history, I found the last copy of the book in the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. So I have a copy of the book written by my great-great-grandfather where he's describing, I'm in Rome now, and this is what I think, and I'm moving on, I'm in Paris now, and now I'm going to...
Just amazing.
So, and then he went on to fight in the Civil War, this is dating war, but he rode a horse, and so he was in the cavalry, you know, like they would charge, you know, on his horse.
We know that the Germans were using horses in World War II.
Oh, in World War II? Yeah, right.
Like they had large amounts of horses were fighting in World War II still. They weren't able to produce their tanks fast enough. So they were still fighting, certainly I think it was on the Eastern Front, majority of it they were fighting on horseback.
Wow.
Which is amazing to think whenever you see a war film, it's tanks and planes, but the Germans were still using
horses as well.
Horses as well.
Well, it makes sense. I mean, that had been the mode for fighting for
centuries. Centuries prior to that. Well, it would be amazing to meet someone that far back in your family. I mean, I've only ever met 3 of my grandparents because my dad's mother passed away unfortunately when he was about 17 or 18. So I've never met her. And one of the people I'd really like to meet is her, because my grandfather, my dad's dad, was a very strong character, but by all accounts she kept him in line. So I think the idea of someone that could, because I know my grandfather, I lived with him for a little while, he's I can't imagine anybody controlling him. but the idea that she was able to is something that I'd really like to meet.
Well, this is a reminder just to mention for your listeners, record your grandparents.
Absolutely,
Sit with them one day, even if it's with your iPhone, and just put on the audio recorder and just say to them, so what was life like when you were 6 years old?
I'm actually,
Then you can have a record that one day, I guarantee you, in 20 years and 30 years, there's going to be no regrets in having a bit of your grandparents' life story.
Unfortunately, my grandparents all died in the 80s, so I haven't got any recordings of them, but I've actually got a plan to sit down with my mum and dad and do that, because I think that my dad grew up in mum and dad both grew up in immediate post-war London. So their perspective on life is very, very different to mine, and I think it's important that we remember that as well. So I want to spend some time just recording what they remember, and just hoping that will be something that's of interest to my kids and their kids and so on. Because I think you're right; those records are really important, and we have with the technology now, there's no reason why we can't do it. So.
That's right. Well, you have no excuses because you got the actual professional equipment. So if you don't do it,
exactly. Nobody's going to. Right, I've got one more question I think I'll ask, because I know you've got to shoot off very shortly. If you could travel somewhere that you've never been on the earth, where would it be? And why haven't you gone yet?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've been really fortunate that I've been able to go to many places. So I've been all through South America, I've been through Central America, I've been all through North America, I've been all through Europe, I've been all through Asia, I've been all through Australia.
Wow.
So the only places left would be Africa and Antarctica. So I think it would be really fun to go to Africa. It would be very different. I haven't been to India yet either, so that would be amazing. I guess the reason I haven't gone there yet is that I've been doing all this other travel and, 4 children. It's a lot of
takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of time.
But I think, going to Africa would be a pretty amazing place. We've got some good friends in different parts there that would be fun to go visit.
Well, going to the seat of humanity, really, isn't it? The Rift Valley is widely recognised as the place where we all came from, and I think we're too quick to belittle Africa as a continent. That it's the birthplace of our race, and we treat it like a mine that we can go and take what we want from whenever we feel like it, and have done that for I'm saying the Westerners have done that for forever, and we've got to have more respect for where we came from. I think,
and also just the variety. I think
absolutely,
it's because you got
it's
all
a
the
huge
deserts
continent
up here, and you've got and Egypt. That would be amazing. Just the history, and then going through. There's so much lush jungles and different things, and then South Africa,
and the wildlife that's over there is amazing as well. My youngest daughter is at Massey University at the moment, studying to be a vet, and she's said that she wants to be a safari park vet. Wants to work on animals in Africa. So, if she does that, I'll certainly be over there. Well, look, I think we should call this to a close, because I know you've got to shoot off, Stephen. It's been fantastic talking to you. Thank you for taking the time. I've really enjoyed it.
And no problem. Maybe we can put a link to our first episode of Seeds so people can listen to that.
Absolutely. Yeah, that'd be good. Yeah, I'll do that.
And I just revamped the website, so it's theseeds.nz, and it's all brand new. So I'm really proud of it.
Fantastic.
And there's a lot of
Well, I'll make sure
there.
I put a link to the Seeds website in the show notes, and it's been really good talking to you. I've really enjoyed the conversation. I hope you have, and hopefully we'll speak again soon.
Thank you for the chance.
Thank you very much. Thank you for listening to my podcast, A Penny for Your Thoughts, with me, Steve Penny. I hope you've enjoyed today's conversation, and I look forward to sharing my next conversation with you. If you want to find out some more, please do get in touch, and maybe we can have you on in a future show. Thank you.